Shana Tova. Over the past few months, it's become more and more difficult for me to listen to or watch the news. Many mornings I still do. I still get into my car to drive to school, and instead of the light-hearted morning show on K-Rock, sometimes I still listen to NPR. But each and every day, it's getting a bit harder. Back in June, we mourned the senseless deaths of 49 beautiful LGBT and ally souls at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando on Latin night. Then in July, we grieved the deaths of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling, 2 more deaths of black men on 2 more not so extraordinary days, causing heartbreak and trauma for communities of color throughout our entire nation. In August, we watched our very own state go up in flames of wildfires as they burned thousands upon thousands of acres. And we watched on television, too, as parts of Louisiana flooded in historic flooding, the worst since Hurricane Sandy. All of these natural disasters, of course, serving to remind us of the stark threats to our natural world that grow more severe each day. In September, we marked 15 years since the attacks of 9/11. And just days later, a bomb exploded in Chelsea, injuring 29 people and reminding us all, yet again, of the uncountable dangers of this world in which we live. This world whose birthday we celebrate this morning on Rosh Hashanah, giving thanks for the countless wonders of creation, the teeming diversity of life on earth. But if you're anything like me, then lately it's probably been harder and harder for you too, to listen to news, to watch it, to read it. Because each and every time I try to stay informed, it seems more and more like the world is falling apart at the seams. Each and every time I tune in and hear about another senseless death, I can't unhear it. Each and every time I'm reminded about the damage being done to our planet, I feel even more helpless. And each and every time I notice the fear, the racism, the xenophobia that catalyzes violence in corners of our country and corners of the world, I notice myself taking another step towards despair. But the shofar calls us to wake up. Teruah, you better not give in to that despair, the shofar calls us. You better not. You've lived another turn around the sun. You better wake up. You better find a way to make things a little bit better in your world. Find a way to make yourself and your world a little better this next time around. But that still small voice within me sometimes nags, how? How can I regain or strengthen a sense of hope within me? What can I do when everywhere I look things seem worse and worse? Scarily enough, it's in moments like this that I can most empathize with Job, our biblical ancestor, who in his grief over the loss of his children and out of his own physical pain, he cries out, "Blot out the day I was born." He'd rather not be alive than be in the pain he's in. So how then do we push back against that despair? How do we listen to the shofar? How do we take that call and let it fill us with resolve, determination, and hope? I wish I had a simple answer to those questions. Instead, what I have for you this morning is 3 different texts from our tradition that I turn to when despair seems poised to take the upper hand on hope. This morning I offer these texts to you that they might bring you the smallest of comforts when your despair seems ready to take over. One of them comes from Psalm 126. It's one of the more famous chapters in the book of Psalms because it's used to begin the prayer after a Shabbat meal. That's how I learned it growing up at one of our Reform Movement summer camps in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. Sometimes when I'm feeling that despair, I can still close my eyes and hear hundreds of voices singing, Shir Hamalo, Beshuv Adonai, Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kechol. But it was long after I first learned to sing those words that I learned what they meant. When God returns Israel from captivity, we will be like dreamers, like cholmim. For laughter will fill our mouths, and those who sow their seeds in tears will reap their harvest in joy. This passage reminds me that it's all right to dream of a better day. Our people have, in fact, basically always been dreamers. Think of Joseph dreaming of a time to come, or think of Theodore Herzl, or Shimon Peres, may his memory be a blessing, dreaming of peace. But just when we feel hopeless about the state of our world, or we feel distant from God, we can too be like dreamers and set our minds on a time when laughter will fill our mouths and we'll reap the fruits of our labor in joy. Another text that speaks to me in these gloomiest moments also comes from the book of Psalms. Jews around the world use Psalm 27 during the month of Elul to prepare for this time, for these Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, these 10 days of Teshuvah. And one of the most famous verses says, one thing, achat sha'alti, one thing I ask from God, only that do I request, to dwell in the house of the Eternal all the days of my life, and to gaze upon God's holy temple. This holy temple is called Heichal in Hebrew, and it's a sort of inner sanctuary in our holiest place. But throughout the last month, I've chosen to engage with this word, this Heichal, in the spirit of our rabbinic ancestors who loved to play with words. When most texts are written without vowels, you see, it's pretty easy to change the pronunciation and change the meaning of a word. So each and every time I sang Heichal, God's holy temple, I sort of turned it around in my head and I thought, Hayachol, the possible. Reading it that way suggests that perhaps one way we can dwell in God's house is by focusing on the possible, on what we're really capable of day to day. It's okay to dream. It's necessary, but we also have to take action to do the possible, to recognize the small steps that we're capable of taking together, to plant the seeds that may someday allow us to reap the benefits. The last text, the third that I'll offer you this morning, that I turn to when that despair seems too heavy, is actually one of the texts that we're going to hear from our Torah in a moment, from the binding of Isaac, the story we read this day each and every year. Now, let's be honest, this story is a bit of a strange coda to come back to each and every year. It forces some difficult questions. Why does Abraham listen to God when God commands him to sacrifice his beloved son? If the whole story is a test, well, did he pass or fail? Where's Sarah in all this? Does Isaac know what's going on, or is he just clueless? Or does he go along willingly? These questions, of course, have fueled countless commentaries and slews of sermons, but I see a clue in the text that I think applies to this question of maintaining our hope and strengthening it. Abraham could have been forlorn at this commandment to sacrifice his son Isaac. He could have gone into autopilot, blindly following God's commandment in hope that his name would be preserved by Ishmael, by his other son. And yet somehow he stays present enough with his son that when they arrive at the mountain, after 3 days' journey, when he takes the wood and the knife, the narrator of our Torah reminds us that after the angel stops him, Vayelchu shnehem yachdav, the two of them walked on together. And just in case we missed that detail, we get it a second time. Father, I see the wood and the knife, but I don't really see the ram for offering. God will see to it, my son. And then our narrator tells us again, Vayelchu shnehem yachdav. They walked along together. Let's face it, this could have been a time to despair. If there was ever a time to despair, you're about to slaughter your own son. This would be it, I think. But they don't. They yelchu shnehem yachdav. They go along together, present with one another, hoping and trusting that something better is going to come. These three texts are not an answer to the question of despair. They cannot answer the question of why the lives of innocent black men are taken and far too often in our country. They cannot end the hatred of the LGBT community that fuels an events like that in Orlando. They cannot prevent the next explosion set off by religious extremists. And they can't solve the existential crises our natural world faces. But these texts can serve as reminders for us that there's always a choice. We can choose to be like those dreamers and keep the hope that someday laughter will fill our mouths as we reap the harvest of our hard work. We can choose to focus our efforts on the possible, on the small actions we can take day in and day out to make our worlds a little bit better. We can choose to follow Abraham's lead and walk on together toward a future of hope. And we can choose to let the call of the shofar remind us that we must do all this biyachad, together. A little over 8 years ago, then Senator Barack Obama spoke about hope as he ran for president. And he said, "Hope is not blind optimism. It's not ignoring the enormity of the task ahead or the roadblocks that stand in our path. Hope is that thing inside us that insists, despite all evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us if we have the courage to reach for it, and to work for it, and to fight for it. Hope is the belief that destiny will not be written for us, but by us, by the men and women who are not content to settle for the world as it is, but who have the courage to remake the world as it should be." I'm reminded of that hope when I sing the blessing on meals on Shabbat, and I'm reminded of it throughout the month of Elul as I sing Psalm 27. And I'm reminded of it again when I hear the shofar, and I am reminded that we must choose to walk together towards hope. May we all remember to dream. May we focus on what is possible, and may we do this all walking together. Shana Tova.